Me shortly will be Thomas Wasson as we break down the broker liability case and what that means for transportation. But we have an action-packed show full of topics to discuss today. And it's, most people don't know this, but June is actually the strongest shipping month of the year due to the combination of all the different commodities that are being shipped in the middle of the year. There's not a lot of seasonal issue there. And you have all this overlap. You have industrial, you have produce, you have beverages, you have summer seasonal apparel, you have back to school that's getting ahead of things. You have all sorts of commodities shipping in the middle of the year that sometimes seasonally depress around the corner months. So like January, retail freight tends to drop off a good bit in January, whereas it's actually fairly active at the end of the year. And that's some of the stuff that we're dealing with in the market, just as we're getting additional reasons to see that capacity is not going to be as plentiful as humanly possible. And Thomas, you're out at a conference, you're joining us live, coming in hot from the road. One of the biggest questions I've been getting over the last several months, and I don't know that this is that shocking, but is how do I get more capacity? And it's like, we went through 3 years where capacity was so available. How much of this are you dealing with?
Oh, man. Well, at an event right now in Nashville, Motive, they're an ELD telematics visibility provider. One of the big words about that is gross negligence. And so when we're talking about these impacts in a post-Montgomery world, the fleets themselves are the front lines. If they have a safety program, if they're using technology, they're coaching their drivers, they are going to be the ones that make or break your brokerage. So when brokerages are asking, how do I get more carriers? It's kind of like thinking about when you're going down the grocery store, how do I get healthier options? Because right now we've had, over the past few years, we had a lot of junk food. We had non-compliant carriers. We had carriers that were basically undercutting rates, not running safe operations. And so the big question moving forward is, well, how do I get them? First off, you got to pay them more. And secondly, I really hope you built your carrier book of business, because right now, if you're trying to ask this question, how do I get more? You are already behind the sticks.
Oh man, it's like I always tell a lot of our shipper customers is, if you don't prepare for a market inflection before it happens, it's too late. You don't have any leverage at that point. So, Thomas, let's get things started, because this is all happening in a market that's already chaotic, in my opinion. From a procurement standpoint, we had tender rejection rates through the roof before this ruling. I don't know that it actually is having a meaningful impact today, but I think over time it will have a stronger influence. Let's get the market in two out of the way so we can dive deeper into this. You want to count me in from the road?
I'll count you down for 5 one last time. Let's go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
All right. So first up, if we have the charts, well, I'll just talk about it. There we go. Tender rejection rates are coming down off of Memorial Day and Road Check Week highs. We talked about this. This is probably going to happen. It doesn't mean the market's soft. We're still above 15% the week after, the week of Memorial Day week. Very expected. You see, there's normally a seasonal kind of downturn through the middle part of June, but it doesn't necessarily mean the market gets soft quickly. I do not expect to see a 10% rejection rate this month. Let's go to the next chart, which is going to be the spot rates, which is what gets a lot of the attention. FTI on top continues to be robust. Data center, AI build out, huge influence there. Power, also a huge influence. And spot rates tend to lag tender rejection. So we want to keep that in mind, that we're still dealing with Memorial Day highs here. This will probably come down here in the next week or so. Just a little bit. Refrigerated and van. What I want to call out here is van spiking faster than refrigerated volume. That is a huge surprise signal to me. Let's go to the next chart. Talk about the STVI, tender volumes, demand. It's fine. It's not growing. It's not dying. It's fine. And I'm not expecting a lot here. It's honestly the least interesting data point that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to move forward and talk about contract versus spot rates in the next chart. This is the one to watch. Spot rates, removing a certain amount of fuel cost comparable to a fuel surcharge, they're skyrocketing compared to contract. This is going to put more pressure on the contract market. Tender rejection rates actually have more pressure when this happens, when spot rates get higher, especially to this level. We have not seen this level since COVID, where the spot rate is above it. Contracts continue to grow. I expect that to happen throughout the year. And it is not necessarily based on fuel, people. It is you cannot pass along fuel if the market will not allow it. Inflationary pressure has existed for the last several years. Carriers just haven't been able to pass it along. So I was watching CNBC this morning, Thomas, and these guys are brilliant. The economists there, they know what they're doing, they know what they're talking about, but it's really, really hard to get into the weeds and understand all the nuance and dynamics of all the different data that they have access to. And one of the areas that they consistently seem to have a misunderstanding of is the transportation market. It's not their job. I don't know a lot about a lot of industries. I know enough about several industries to be dangerous. And they were making the comment around how oil prices were influencing fuel prices and based on the transportation cost. And this is a level of misunderstanding that's a derivative of misunderstanding. So it's like everyone thinks the fuel prices, and that's the easy answer to state, and it does have an influence. It's not nothing. But you and I both know, having worked in the space, that oil prices did not send transportation prices into the stratosphere. The market was tightening in Christmas, and then it stayed tight as we had Winter Storm Fern because we had supply side issues, contractions. We had a lot of capacity coming offline over the last 3 years because of the challenging environment. And then the barriers to entry started creeping a little bit higher with some of the, non-domiciled stuff that we've talked about in the past. And now we're in a market where we don't have enough trucks. And then the oil story on top of that is also an inflationary pressure, which is helping keep rates higher, but it's not necessarily the big story or why it costs more to have produce shipped to your stores. The rates were already going up. Fuel just kind of adds to that layer in that story.
It does. And I mean, look at the data from 2021 and 2022. So when we want to look at the COVID highs, we had very low fuel prices, $3.20-ish range in 2021. By 2022, we had we were beginning of the Great Freight Recession and whatnot, but, fuel prices were extremely high because Russia and Ukraine with the conflict. And we've seen a similar spike in fuel right now. It tells me that, when folks are thinking of fuel causing higher transportation costs, they do in some extent, but they really don't understand the nuance, which is trucking supply and demand. It's really pretty much 101, economics 101. And so, I kind of got to give them a little bit of slack. Typically, we see, and you know this as well, a lot of times people will argue that it is truckload demand that changes the freight cycle. And this is one for the record books, and that we're seeing supply related constraints. Just like you said, we had carrier bankruptcies, we had exits out of the market, we've had operators. I'll give you an example. I'm at the Motive event. I talked to the tow truck bro. And one of the problems with the tow truck guys is that they have to, deal with accidents. And so one of these guys who gets calls from law enforcement, they've seen 30% fewer towable incidences within a certain tranche of carriers who had the little stickers on the side of their truck with a magic marker saying, "This is my carrier." Typically, we see that in terms of chameleon carriers, low cost, non-compliant carriers. He said the issue was most of those guys would only pay like 40% of the time. So the odds were that these carriers, they have been leaving the marketplace. They were basically undercutting rates due to economic arbitrage. Obviously, they could pay their drivers less. And so we are seeing meaningful impacts in other channels that the supply of trucking and labor is actually changing. And we're going to hear also, by the way, a driver shortage narrative may return because of not only the fact that it's harder to hold on to your drivers in an upcycle, they're going to start jumping around trying to chase the sign-on bonuses. We'll see a lot of movement in the driver labor population. I think we will see wages go up. We had Nussbaum recently announce, a very large carrier, that they are giving their drivers wages. That is huge. The last time they did it was 2020 or 2022. It's been years since we've seen carriers say that they're willing to put their money where their mouth is and have the money to pay for it. So I think we have a lot of stuff to keep paying attention to in the supply side. And unfortunately for shippers and brokers who are finally paying attention, you're going to be in a bad spot, my dude. Because like you brought up earlier, we should have had this conversation on Christmas. We should have got our carriers together. We should have evaluated our routing guides, and we should have figured out, what do I need to do to position myself to become a shipper of choice? Because as soon as my demand changes in a little bit, there's just not a lot of room to soak that up.
Yeah. And I talked about the produce being a thing, and I got to tease out something that, we've recently released sit reps and sonar. So the sonar users out there can actually look at something that has some detailed research around the produce seasonality. I actually learned something going through this, and we're in what is peak seasonal pressure for pricing. This is based on a derivative of rates and tender data. So we see a lot of even non-produced shippers or non-produce carriers feel this pressure from the market, even though they're not hauling produce. And peak seasonality for produce actually lands in June, but it's not evenly distributed. You can see this chart here actually lines out the main produce origin areas: Northwest, Florida, the border crossings in Mexico, Tucson, Nogales, Central California Valley there. Right now, we actually have the highest amount of seasonal pressure coming into the California season, but we have the most volume, if you add them all together, occurs right now in this month. And, I alluded to this to start the show. June is actually the highest volume month for shipping, and produce is one of those. I think the big read there in that chart, though, is that most of the pressure for produce happens late in the year. If you look at all of those rates and pressures, it actually starts compiling late year. And even though we think seasonal pressure for produce happens in April, May, because California gets a lot of the headlines. Interesting report. If you're a Sonar subscriber, you can go into the sit reps and read about that, among other things, especially broker liability, the data center reports that we put out, as well as a few others that are very interesting. I want to hit on the economics real quick before we break down this broker liability. We had the PCE come out today. This is important because the Fed's monitoring inflation. And of course, everybody's going to say inflation's about oil and this Iranian conflict is going to create all this downstream. And absolutely, that's absolutely happening. But like I mentioned, transportation costs were inflating without oil. And there's some level of complexity here that you cannot dismiss as just transitory inflation. There is components and charges and costs that are going up because of structural problems that aren't going to go away when the conflict resolves. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Specifically, a 0.5% of the PCE's increase was in food. So is that structural? Is it oil? I mean, the CNBC guy said it was, but we know that if you're hauling stuff on a truck, a lot of that inflation is actually something that has been buried in trucking. We have not been able to pass along a lot of those costs in trucking for 3 years now, and that's going to be stickier inflation. So definitely something to watch. Oil is not the sole reason for a lot of this inflation. Obviously, the majority of it, I think 3.8% is relatively high. CPI was 3.8% in April as well. The scary one is 6% for the PPI, which is all the input costs in April. Hopefully that's one of those things that gets pulled back because those eventually will get passed along. There are some concerns about late year inflation showing up because of that. But for now, the consumer is doing all right. We had good spending in the month of March. So there's no, yes, there are concerns about debt levels and things like that. Durable goods, new orders. This chart that you're looking at here blew everyone away. Now, breaking it down is a 7.9%. Annualized growth. They were expecting around 3.5% to 4%. So why did they beat so strongly? Well, a lot of it was commercial aircraft, which is expensive stuff. And then there was transportation and high-tech equipment. This data center, this AI investment continues to be an outperformer despite higher interest rates. Hyperscalers and AI do not care. I read something from Torsten Slok about this, about how anybody that's hyperscaling AI right now, which is obviously a huge part of our economy, they are building at a pace. They do not care about debt because the return on their investment they foresee being so high. These nominal interest rate increases or whatever we're seeing in the 10-year and 30-year notes or short-year notes, they don't matter to them. This is nothing for them because their returns are expected to be so high. So definitely something to watch. If you remove the high value stuff from that figure, it's a 1.1% increase for durable goods, which is still good overall. So let's remove a little bit of the headline and kind of come back down to earth. In other news, the GDP was revised lower to about 1.6 in the first quarter. I'm not really worried about GDP figures at this point because there's so much noise. And then jobless claims, we hit 215 this week. Still historically low. This is one of the best recession signals we've seen over time. When we see these things percolate, you can see though in COVID in 2021, we had lots of jobless claims and the economy was booming. So let's also not take this too hard. Jobless claims are still all right, in my opinion, even though we hit pretty historic lows recently. So Thomas, moving on back into the freight market, I want to talk about John Kingston's article on BMO, because I think that also leads us back into this discussion around broker liability and capacity. John Kingston wrote fantastic article. We're not going to get this data much longer. They're getting purchased here probably in the fourth quarter, but they lend money to carriers essentially as a part of their portfolio of business. And the tweet that he put out essentially shows no real change, actually a little bit of an uptick in their second quarter. Their fiscal year ends in November, so they end their second quarter in April, end of April. If you look at this chart, year over year, I mean, it's still elevated, distressed credit as they view it. So there's not a huge change here. And this is fundamental data, mind you. This is banking, lending data. So when we see carriers are still struggling to an extent, even though we've had high rates, that doesn't necessarily mean that we've had high rates for long enough to have a sustainable impact on a lot of these carriers and these fleets. And of course, broker liability is going to have a pretty big influence here as some of these carriers no longer have access to freight through the same channels.
Exactly. And that's one of the things I think that folks don't understand is it takes time for these carriers. These guys are dealing with 3 to 4 years of, higher upfront costs, shrinking margins. You don't suddenly just flip a switch because you had a great Q4 and rates are improving. They're up double digits year over year in certain key areas. But at the end of the day, you've got a hole that you've got to climb out of. And so we've also seen that in the equipment market as well. How are you going to make decisions on your capital expenditure? One of the things at this Motive conference, fleets are trying to do more with less. Automation is a very large one. Agentic AI to help with maintenance decisions, everything from driver scorecards, safeties, dash cameras. They're trying to squeeze every little bit, little ounce. When we're talking everything from Halliburton KBR with tens of thousands of vehicles to, think of Thomas's trucking with a handful of vehicles as an example. These fleets are going to continue to try to figure it out. I think broker liability is going to be one of the larger things. The questions has always been for these, I'm going to call them less compliant carriers. Because there's a whole rabbit hole with non-dom CDLs and that shebang. But carriers that were operating less efficiency, less compliant, less safe, their equipment's not being taken care of, they're naturally going to start to see some problems because there is, like I said earlier, the big gross negligence term. And for freight brokers, you don't even want to be added to the case. That's the problem. It opens the door. So when we're looking for the takes, we know it's going to have a very big shakeup. But of course, it's going to take months for the legal system to start tackling it. And it will set the stage for one of the biggest questions of them all, which is what is a safe carrier? CVSA, there, you have your CVSA scores and everything else, safety scores. But at the end of the day, I think this is going to be a more positive development because we need to see from the FMCSA, what does a safe carrier look like? What's a legit carrier? I'm going to give you one more example. I can go downstairs at the JW Marriott and I can pick a wine. I'll pick an Italian one, for instance. It's got DOCG, Domaine Originale Group Control. It will tell me the exact village where that grape came from. Why is it that I can buy a wine and know the grape, but I can't figure out if my carrier has a seal of legitness? That's one of our problems that I think in the coming months we're going to have to start reckoning with is what kind of carrier, who are you sourcing, and were those grapes or were those trucks really who they said they were?
Oh, 100%. So, Rob Carpenter wrote an article recently, How Legislators and Insurers Built a Trucking Crisis. And basically, I don't have time to go through this in massive detail, but some of the biggest takeaway for me, obviously insurance costs have gone up significantly. I think 38% over the last 10 years or something like that, roughly 10.2 cents per mile, according to ATRI data. But one of the reasons this has occurred is because a lot of the insurance companies, he calls out Geico and Progressive specifically, saying, you can come and get insurance, you're going to pay for it. So basically, instead of them vetting the carriers and saying you need to go through some sort of process to get insurance coverage, if you have enough money, we'll give you insurance and just basically allow you to enter the space. So there's no guardrail from the insurance side that has actually occurred there, even though the industry's actually gotten safer over the last bit, according to a lot of the data. So it's an insurance issue that's causing a lot of these problems because there's not as much of a gateway. And of course, it's just inflationary. It's not really providing a lot of actual value. And I think this broker liability on some level will help that. And again, we've got a chart queued up here. There's a couple of charts. Net changes in FMCSA, so operating authorities. Yes, it's gone slightly positive. If you're reading this chart, anything in red is a net addition. Anything in red is a net contraction. Anything in green is a net addition. It's mildly positive. It biases towards growth. We're not seeing a huge upswing here. And if we go to the net revocations chart, it's actually showing that carriers are still going out. So, and this is a very slow data set. We only see this after months of inactivity, or if somebody actually volunteers the information that they're out of the space. So we're not seeing a huge amount of change or shift in this market where carriers are actually looking like they're growing or coming into the space. So capacity coming in, it's not outsized. And the fact that we're still seeing carrier exits on this level is also an issue. So getting into the broker liability and carrier vetting, I wrote a chart of the week a few weeks ago on what SCOTUS ruling means for rates. There's a few things to basically ground yourself. There's a lot of hyperbole here. Even Craig's come out on State of Rate last week and said, nobody really knows the full consequence of this. That is the thing to keep in mind as we talk it through. Some of the things that we do know. Insurance does not exist for this yet. It will, and they are going through that right now. There's a lot of people that on Thursday, when they announced this 2-3 weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, they had meetings at 3 p.m. that day. It was announced at 10 a.m., 3 p.m. there were meetings. So carrier vetting will go through another long, drawn-out process of changing. What that looks like, nobody really knows. But it will change, and it will be inflationary because you're adding layers of process. You're adding insurance coverage that doesn't exist, that's going to be lots higher than it is today. And then you have something you were alluding to. Carriers with limited history or safety score issues, which is a broken mechanism, mind you, insufficiently done because we have not put any investment or time or energy into it yet, it's not there. So we're going to go through a process of figuring out what that means. And a lot of these carriers that don't have history or scores that are valid, not going to work out. And one of the things I encourage everyone to look at is we have a sit rep out or a new dashboard in Sonar, and I'm going to pull up that heat map now. These are the states with the highest incident rates. Texas is a big sore thumb sticking out on this. There's a lot of freight coming in and out of Texas. So this is going to be the type of data that people rely on to look at insurance coverages, inflation to rates, inflation to operating costs. These areas where these states are in orange, they're going to be the ones that get hit the hardest.
Exactly. And I mean, when we're going to obviously see brokerages, larger, more capitalized brokerages are going to have more opportunities to fight this. They're going to have the legal resources. Smaller freight brokerages, it's going to be a challenge. The question they're going to argue, and this is why it's kind of like the opening salvo, is what does gross negligence look like for a freight broker? Because let's say that I do hire a trucking company. Its safer score is good. It's set up with a third-party validating platform, but it bumps into a vehicle. I'll give you a great example. A carrier I talked with today at this Motive event, actually yesterday, their driver bumped into a vehicle that was stopped in traffic. It was a $600 boo-boo. You got to fix the back end. That person gets out of the car, starts the first thing they do is lawyer up. And you know what the lawyers do in Florida? They go after $1 million. That's the max coverage. They go for the max. It's extortive, I tell you. So then you have a $600 problem turns into a $45,000 to $50,000 settlement because you can't afford to spend $150,000 to prove that you're right. This is the calculus for insurers. So when you're thinking of progressives and the other ones, one of the things that may not be very good for these sketchball carriers that are not operating correctly is that they're forcing for you to have dash cameras front and rear facing. They're actually incorporating for you to have the right policy and not pay out the yin yang. You need to utilize these telematics and validation devices. So we're going to see a change over there. The brokers are going to get these things tied up in court because, the spicy take for me is if I'm a freight broker, if it looks good and the FMCSA data is good, the CVSA data is good, and I did everything right, how is that still negligence when you try to go upstream? I think, honestly, my personal take, raise the minimum to $3 million. It was $750,000 since the 1980s. You know why the lawyers are suing upstream? Because the costs of inflation for heinous injuries in their mind ain't enough to cover. They got to collect, they got to make you whole. And so you raise that guaranteed minimum up to $3 million. I know a lot of owner operators and drivers don't want to pay that, but you're going to pay it in one fair. The tally man, you're always going to get your dues here. And so how do you want to do it? Do you want to have a load board deny you because you're sketchy? You want to have a higher guaranteed minimum? These are going to be the bigger questions we're going to have to suss out. I don't think it's going to somehow be an apocalypse now scenario, but for these freight brokerages, one of the big key takeaways we have to keep in mind is this is going to be a months-long process, and the only way to figure it out is get your butt sued, and that's going to take a few extra months. So buckle up.
Yeah, I think we're going to learn a lot more in the next case. Where's the first wave of cases going to happen? They're going to have to lay some things out, lay some groundwork that makes it a little bit more specific. Right now, we have a lot of vague language, reasonable care. What does that mean? How much government involvement does that actually entail? I think we're going to see a rise of a cottage industry that's going to come out of this as well. So carrier vetting, insurance costs, they're going up. Gonna have to deal with it. What that means in total, I don't know. Also, we got a FedEx spinoff coming up this month. Man, lots of news.